Buenos días, damas y caballeros. Es con mucho gusto que les doy la bienvenida a este evento del Consejo Canadiense para las Américas. Nos encanta poder tener esta reunión en presencial con seres humanos en vez de pantallas. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Kip Dexel. I'm a partner here in the business law group at Dentons. I'm also chair of the Latin American desk. For those of you who are not overly familiar with our firm, we are the firm that's probably the most committed to Latin America of all the firms in the world. We have a phenomenal network that covers pretty much every country in the region with exceptionally qualified lawyers. We do mining work, we do corporate M&A work, and we do financing work. In fact, we have a colleague who's represented one major government in its renegotiation of its sovereign debt. So we do lots of interesting work. We'd be delighted to work with you if you have any activities down there. And in fact, our commitment is such that we have lawyers from the region in this office. We have a lawyer who's from Venezuela, who's Venezuelan trained and Ontario trained. We have a lawyer who's from Brazil, who's Brazilian qualified and Ontario qualified. We have a Canadian lawyer from Colombia. And we have, of course, myself, a Canadian lawyer from Ottawa. So, you didn't know Ottawa was part of Latin America? But. The other hat that I'm wearing and welcoming you is as a proud member of the board of the Canadian Council for the Americas. And I think that the word that best describes the Canadian Council is bridge. The council is a bridge between Canada and the region, Latin America and the Caribbean. It's a bridge for the business community. It's a bridge for the broader community. And quite frankly, it's a bridge for governments. And I'll give you a very concrete example of that. Because of the phenomenal work of our team, Ken and Marta, we were able to throw together a lunch in Ottawa for the new president of Chile. We were able to, when the president was aware that Jean Chrétien was going to be at that event, he's a colleague of ours at the firm, he insisted that he sit next to him so that he could pick his brain and get some insight from one of the perhaps most elderly statesmen of the Americas to the newest, youngest statesman of the Americas. And that only happened because of the Canadian Council for the Americas. So this is an organization that matters. It matters for the region, it matters for our country, and increasingly it matters for people outside the region. And I'll give you another concrete example of that. Our president, Ken Frankel, was interviewed the other day by France 24, which many of you may know that the French network, like the BBC, has a wonderful, wonderful network in Spanish. And so here was this European-based telecommunications organization interviewing our president to explain what was happening with the meeting of the three amigos in Mexico City. So just to show you that we matter also for the world outside of the region, increasingly so. And I just want to mention also that we have a phenomenal board. We have a presence that stretches across Canada through our board members. We have representation from Alberta. We have representation from Quebec. We even have a proud Nova Scotian on our board. And so we have a Canadian presence, a Canadian-wide presence as well. We are proudly independent. We get no government funding. Ottawa is very helpful in assuring that remains that way. But maybe that will change, we'll see. So if you're not already involved with us, we welcome you to become involved. And I think, as you will see from this event, which has always been our signature event for launching the year, we have exceptionally high quality people. And so I hope you enjoy the event. I understand that there are people that are also participating through online. So our audience is even broader than the people that are here. So again, welcome. Muchas gracias. Ken?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kip.
Sorry, one other thing.
Yeah.
I forgot to mention a special welcome to our special guests. We have with us the Consul General of Brazil, and hopefully I'll get this right, Juana Campos de Nobrega. Please stand up. Thank you so much.
Forward here and learn from you about Brazil.
Yeah, there's lots happening in Brazil these days. And then we also have the Consul General from Uruguay, Daniel Carinazzi. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here again.
Thank you for coming. Okay, Ken, now you can take it over.
Thank you, Kip. Any questions? Thank you very much, Kip. It's always a pleasure to collaborate with Dentons. The hospitality is first class. Particular thanks to Peggy, Nori, and Andrew, who really made this possible. There's a lot of work goes on behind the scenes. Those of you watching virtually may not appreciate the amount of technical expertise and sophistication sitting in this room right now and the people dedicated. So thank you, Kip. And yes, we do remember many good events with Mr. Kretchen, including the one with President Boric. And also, thank you to our annual sponsors. You can see their names there. Without them, this event doesn't happen. There is no CCA. So we thank them, as we always do in all of our events and announcements for what we do. Thank you to them. Again, thank you to all of you for coming, the Diplomatic Corps, Kip just mentioned. We know there's many in Diplomatic Corps throughout the hemisphere and in Europe who are listening to this as well. So, bienvenidos a todos ustedes igual también. This is our 13th edition, and as in the other editions, we will take questions from the audience by live mic. The request always is that it be very brief. Maybe one sentence is the best. Something that sounds like it has a question mark at the end. Diatribes don't generally work that well on limited time. We'll also entertain questions from the virtual audience. Marta will be monitoring to those and bring them up to me. We'll do our best to accommodate them. We never get to all of them. And the questions, particularly the ones from the folks sitting here, we'll try and intersperse throughout, not necessarily wait to the end. So if there's a point where I think it's a good time to start taking questions, then we'll open it up. Marta has the microphone, and it'll be easy enough to manipulate that. This obviously is on the record. It's being recorded. It will be posted on our website very, very soon, probably by tomorrow, if past experience is correct. I don't want to say more because these are the people who are going to be speaking. I will introduce them. Many of you know many of them, if not all of them. The reason why they're always back here is because everybody loves what they have to say and always comes away listening to them, taking it down, and then often reviewing the video afterwards because they wanted to make sure they caught everything. So the point of this whole event is to combine insight on the underlying global and regional trends with some country-specific expertise as well. So the aim is to provide something a little more subtle and nuanced than you would hear from your average Colombian right-wing ideologue, and a little bit more concrete than your average left-wing Argentine sociologist. That's the spectrum that we're going for here. The panelists that we have today are, well, to my immediate left is Fiona Mackie, Director, Latin America and the Caribbean at the Economist Intelligence Unit. Jonathan Hausman, who is our chairman, is the Executive Managing Director, Global Investment Strategy at Ontario Teachers Pension Plan. Solange is sitting next to Jonathan. She's the representative in Canada of COMEXI and a professor at UNAM in Mexico City. Eduardo Suarez is Vice President, Latin America Economics at Scotiabank. And John Price, also a board member, is Managing Director of America's Market Intelligence. We also have online, which we will bring in for our discussion on Brazil, Melina Risso, who's a Research Director at Igarapé Instituto in Rio de Janeiro. So with that, let's get right to the conversation. And I'll first ask Jonathan to talk a bit about the global trends, where Latin America fits into the global trends, and why Latin America matters.
Thanks a lot, Ken. And as Ken mentioned, I am chair, and I want to welcome all of you and thank you for coming. And my comments are as chair, so I'll have a little bit of latitude in my discussion. So thank you, Ken, for the question. We live in pretty interesting times. Some assumptions that we have as financial investors, but also as corporates and as bankers, et cetera, that we've taken for granted for many, many years have begun to change. And that will likewise have an impact on how we think about Latin America. The headline is that the current dynamics, both political and economic, and I would argue even climatological, all re-underwrite Latin America. We went through a long period where the familiar risks that we face in Latin America were viewed rather with a jaundiced eye. Today, those seem smaller in comparison to other risks that we face, which are frankly more difficult and intractable to manage as financial investors. Now, we will remain a global investor, obviously, and so will most of you. But it's about the weights that you place upon the geographies around the world. So let me make 3 points about why Latin America is re-underwritten by the current environment. The first has to do with some boring but important stuff about economic management. So there's some horrible economic management in Latin America. Luckily, most people don't invest in those countries. But there's also some pretty orthodox economic management. And I'll focus especially on the management of this new phenomenon that apparently no one in North America ever thought would come back, which is called inflation. Well, nobody needs to explain to people in Brazil about inflation. And as a result, the management of inflation was earlier, better, and faster in Brazil than it was in the United States, the paragon of financial capitalism. So why? So what I'm trying to say essentially is that experience matters. And there's a reason why the peak, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, Eduardo, but the peak inflation in Brazil in 22 was 6%, and why it was 8% in the United States is because they started hiking early. And by hiking early, they managed a problem that, for some reason, beguiled the central banks of both Europe and the United States. Not Japan. I have quite high regard for Mr. Kuroda. So economic management matters. Now, of course, that will mean that we will have a slowdown, an economic slowdown in countries like Chile, Brazil, Mexico to a lesser degree. But is a slowdown that is a more manageable one than the kind of roller coaster that we're looking at in the United States. The second thing is about the bifurcation that's taking place. Now, some people will say that this bifurcation is happening at a very rapid pace, and some people will say that actually it's not happening much at all between the United States and China. I'm not here to talk about, why and what the enmity is growing between China and the United States. It doesn't really matter. What does matter is it creates flows, and those flows are changing. So let's just be clear. What we're talking about is resilience on the part of companies. Companies, they sit, they look at the world, they sit in their boardrooms, they're like, I'm not sure if you're sitting at Apple, you want 84% of your handsets made in China. Not a criticism of China, it's just not good management. So of course, and with Eduardo, I'm sure you've seen this, there is this plant among the 3 plants I think Foxconn has in Mexico. There's this plant in Ciudad Juarez, if I'm not mistaken, which is the size of 7 Ceausescu palaces in a row. Okay, it is huge, and they got their own like highway border lane for themselves going to Texas. Why? It's because of this trend of resilience. And if Apple's doing it, I can assure you, Westinghouse is doing it, and Walmart is doing it, everybody's doing it. So that means flows, and that's really good for Latin America. It's particularly good for Mexico because they're stuck in the United States, which is fantastic for them. But this is a major trend, and it does re-underwrite Latin America more broadly. Third is about abundance and scarcity. Now, I was born in 1967. Yes, that makes me 55, which is a long time ago. I have never in my entire childhood or early adolescence or adult life ever thought about the fact that the world would run out of things. We were brought up to think that we lived in a world of abundance. And coming from Canada, it's kind of hard not to have abundance. The only thing we don't have a lot of is people and warmth. But what we do have is everything else. And
There's a lot of warmth in this room.
There's a lot of warmth in this room, but it's actually not even cold outside, to be honest. But I'll get to that on the climatological side. But the point I'm making is that we now live in a world of scarcity. And some of this scarcity is caused by really bad policymaking, i.e. Gerhard Schroeder, or some of it just because, sorry, but there's just not a lot of stuff around. And Latin America has everything, just like Canada. It has everything. Brazil in particular has everything, but the truth is Colombia, Mexico, they have everything you want. It's all there. And now that value of that is going up because there's just not enough, because our population in the world, it's, by the way, it's not hugely growing, but the composition of the population is increasing among those demographics that have 60% of their household budget in energy and food. That's what poor people need, and that's who's coming up. And what does Brazil and Colombia and Peru and Chile have? Food and energy. Final point, climate. So climate's going to make the area between the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn really, really tough. The truth is that that requires mitigation, and mitigation requires minerals, and minerals are found in Latin America that contribute to it. Where it's in Chile, which I was in recently, and we had interesting conversations with government officials about what they're going to do about rare earths, particularly lithium, and it has to do with copper, and that's what they got in Peru and Chile. Now, Peru's got clearly some governance issues, but nonetheless, it's in the ground. So, am I being very, very cheerful here about LATAM? Yes. But I'll just say one thing. The risk that I sense is that there's been a North Star for, LATAM is such a broad term, but for a number of big important countries in LATAM, a North Star which has been the Washington Consensus. And that Washington Consensus is now not even followed in Washington, so it's not much of a consensus. So the difficulty is that we like what's in LATAM, big EM countries, because there's a Western democratic model and there's a Western economic model, the consensus, and those are now in question. And actually, it wasn't lost on anyone that the attack on the Congress, Presidential Palace, and Supreme Court that happened almost just a year after what happened in the United States took place a year after what took place in the United States. So clearly that consensus is breaking down. So there's an unmooring that's taking place, and it does concern me that maybe there's something that will slip. But looking at its snapshot today, 23 looks pretty good for LATAM if you're willing to endure a slow economy.
Thank you, Jonathan. Fiona, you have the unenviable task of following Jonathan.
Oh, that's a tough one. You said it all. I'll try and add a little bit to that. At the risk of sounding a little bit too academic, we could say that sort of investors into Latin America are looking at three things, or investors anywhere. So they're resource seeking, their efficiency seeking, and their market seeking. And I think that Latin America offers some of that in all those three areas. So Jonathan was talking about resources, and now more than ever, that's important to the global economy, and Latin America has all that. So it has the materials needed for the energy transition, the lithium, the cobalt, the copper, rare earths. It has all of that. Food security, it's right at the top of the agenda. So we might see things like going forwards like EU, Mercosur. So Latin America is sort of very attractive from that sense of its resource endowment. But there's also market seeking. So you could be looking to sell into a market. In Latin America, many countries in Latin America are in a demographic sweet spot where their consumers start to buy more stuff. So in some sense, it's sort of attractive sort of as a market to sell into for some investors. And then in terms of efficiency seeking, so we're talking a lot about labor costs. Now, labor costs is obviously not the only thing that matters in an investment decision, or even when you consider the labor market overall, but let's not underestimate how important it is. And if you look out over, if you're making an investment decision that's not about today, but about 5 years out or 10 years out, and you look at rapid wage growth in Asia, you can see that Latin America will be very attractive in terms of cost competitiveness 5 years from now and 10 years from now, and even now. And so businesses will be taking that into account in their long-term investments. So that's all very attractive. I think the one thing that's probably sort of missing to take advantage of that, and to take advantage of these other global trends around the bifurcation and just security of supply chain and good management that Jonathan mentioned, is there's a couple of things. One is growth. So businesses would like to ride on the coattails of an economy that's growing rapidly to grow their profits rapidly. And then the other thing is sort of there are a few things. So there's the business environment, and we could say that there are concerns in some countries around the business environment and contract rights. And then there are big long-term questions that we all know about, which I would say is infrastructure, technology, and human capital. So those are the weaknesses that have to be sort of taken into account in any investment decision. Those are the areas also that should form the basis of a constructive engagement at the government level of the likes of Canada, the US, Europe, and China around sort of creating those deeper links with Latin America to the benefit of growth in Latin America, to the benefit of, for example, Canadian companies operating there.
Thank you, Fiona. We're going to come back, stay with the economic theme a bit with Eduardo and John in a minute, but I want to give Solange a chance to jump in to talk a little bit about political issues related to globally in Latin America.
Thank you, Ken, and thank you for the invitation. I am very, very happy to be here. And yeah, I am not economist, so I prefer to talk about the political side of all of this. And the first thing that I want to point out is that there is a 2023, we will face new governments in Latin America. And there have been talking, analysts around the world have been talking about the pink tide. And I want to address this because it is very important to understand what is really happening in those changes in Latin American governments. And the first thing is that the pink tide is a myth. It is not really that the region is becoming left just because of the left governments are gaining power because of that kind of ideology in the region. What is happening is that the vote is a anti-incumbency vote, and how we can prove that? If we look at the map in 2019 and we look at the map in 2022, we can see that the countries that changed government, there were 15 elections, presidential elections in those 4 years. And 14 of those changed government, and they changed to the other side. If we had a right government, a right party government, we changed to the left, and the other way. What happened is that in 2019 we had more right governments in the region, so they changed, and now we have seen all these left governments, but not because of that governments are gaining power. So what we are going to see is in 2023 and the next and the coming elections in 2024 is going to be also changing these governments again. So we will see again changing from left to right. Why we can explain this? We can explain this because people is tired of poverty. Poverty has increased in the last years a lot in the region. We came from in 2021. We see an increase on 34% of poverty in the region. So we are talking about more than 200 million more poor people in the region, and from those, there is around 13% in extreme poverty. So we're talking about 80 million people in extreme poverty now in the region. So what people is looking at is responses, is answers to what they need. And if the politicians that promise food in the table, healthcare, education are coming from the right or the left, it doesn't matter. What matters is that they promise something, and it is very easy for populist governments, and that led me to my second point, that leads to populism rise in the region. It doesn't matter if the populist government are coming from the right or the left. So what we are going to see is maybe in the next elections another change. Not in all countries. In the case of, for example, in Mexico, we will see Morena, which is not exactly left, it is center left, stay in power. But other countries, we are going to change again from left to right. So this pink tide is not something real. So. Another thing is important to say that it is this populist rise, and this is led because of the people in the region are disappointed with democracy, which is a very huge risk for all the countries. people used to believe in democratic values in the region. We came from, in 2010, people's support of democracy was about 63%. And last year it was about 43%. So people is disappointed with democracy, and that led to the possibility to the agreement from citizens in all these countries, to the agreement of being in an autocratic regimes, if that leaders promise food in the table, house and healthcare and education. So that is the biggest risk I see. And the last one is that this also led to nationalistic approach. Why? Because for leaders, it's very easy to promise. There is no problem. If you're in campaign, you can promise healthcare, you can promise everything. But when you are in the government, it is not easy to fulfill. So what you need is a narrative to continue in power. So this narrative leads to polarization, to radicalization. So that's why we have been seeing all these governments increasing in this polarization, speeches, and this creation of enemies. There is no populist government that can continue in power without an enemy. So this is not something that is just happening in Latin America. We see this in Turkey, we see it in Hungary, we see this in autocratic regimes. But Latin America has this other side, which is the nationalistic approach. So this nationalistic approach is going to make difficulties or more difficult for businesses to be, especially for investors, foreign investors, to be in the country, because it is not easy for these governments to maintain foreign investment together with the nationalistic narrative. So I will leave my comments there, but I think we need to understand the causes of the changes and what is going to be for these new governments in the coming years. And if we understand the causes, it is going to be easiest for us to understand what is going to happen and how to lead with these new governments in the coming years.
Thank you very much, Solange. I want to come to Eduardo and John. We're way over time because we need to get results.
I'll be super.
So very, very brief. Let me just keep dangling. These conversations around economic models happen every year, right? And we saw during COVID, particularly the much vaunted move into more people into the middle class in various countries, how quickly that has been wiped away. We're back to the high levels of extreme poverty. I think Colombia is the worst in all of South America, for example. The inequality that's persistent. It's every year. And so you now have 3, let's say, self-described progressive governments in South America. And the question that looms over this, and maybe this is now not time to do it in the next 30 seconds, but we come back to is, at some point, one must question, is this model really the correct model for this region? Or what kind of major tinkering needs to get done so that we don't have this same repetitive conversation every year about the levels of poverty? And now we can see the conversation is what the ramifications of that are politically and how that may be playing out. With having said that, Eduardo, please briefly.
Yes, of course. A friend after last year's panel told me I always close on a negative note, and he told me my nickname should be Edum. So this time I'm going to flip it around. I'm going to start with the negative and go to the positive from that. I think Latin America has two big challenges right now because of changes in the global conditions. Solange just mentioned the shift to nationalism. The shift to nationalism has a problem that a lot of these nationalist governments are taking the key levers of economies and seeing us the way they will control things. Even in an example, Mexico, the nationalist is a trend of AMLO on energy had a very big shift. It used to be all about oil, but oil in Mexico is increasingly less important. The important driver of a manufacturing economy's power. His nationalism is now focused on controlling the lever that moves the economy. That's something I worry about, because if governments control the key levers of economies, you have to be careful that they don't break things. The second challenge we have is that we've had a big structural shift in the planet. We had 40 years of a world that was globalizing. Trend as a share of the global economy more than doubled to 60%. Capital flows globally were rising. In that environment, when the world is globalizing, supply chains are being optimized. You're moving production to where it's cheaper. That's a disinflationary force. During those 40-year period, we had US inflation fall from 16% to 2%. We had 10-year treasuries in the US fall from 16% to 1.7%. That period is essentially over. The last moment of a concerted globalizing push was the Chicago G20 meeting in 2009, when China and the US were still friends. They sat together and they wrote a $3 trillion check to bail out the world. Since then, global trade has fallen from 62% to 50% of global GDP. It's now on a clear downward trend. But with that deglobalization, you're having the disinflationary forces of the world also breaking. So I think one of the risks we face now is that global interest rates going forward are going to be higher. And for Latin America, that's going to be, for me, the second major challenge. You have a region where we have lots of needs, a region that needs to spend on education, infrastructure, developing all those natural resources, but it's going to be with a higher hurdle rate for its capital needs. So with that, I will end on my doom side, and I will say what I think is positive. One thing I see with all my clients from around the world, such as Jonathan's fund, is that the funds of the world are becoming very, very, very large. With that trend to become larger and larger, a lot of them have become too large to even think about short-term dynamics, and they're even restructuring their businesses to be able to tap these long-term trends and focus their capital on longer-term trends. And with that, the shift of geopolitics is becoming more important, which is also happening at a time when global geopolitics are shifting. We're moving from a globalized world into a world cut into blocks. And in that perspective, I would say is one of the first opportunities of Latin America. Outside of a few countries which already are butting heads with the West, the rest don't look like they're likely to consider a serious bout of butting heads with the US over the next 10, 20 years. And that means that if you're thinking about long-term capital deployment and you worry that at some point you may have the kind of problems that Western investors had in Russia, where suddenly you were caught with your hands in the cookie jar, Latin America is a fairly safe bet. So that's one of the opportunities the region has to tap, and it's an important lesson that I think Latin American politicians have to bear in mind. You don't want to butt heads with the people who feed you. The second thing the region has is that it has, as Jonathan already said, very important endowments, lithium in Chile, cheap labor in Mexico, food in Brazil, Colombia, and Peru. Ukraine, for example, is something like 14% of the world's caloric production. The world needs to be fed. One of the few things you don't stop spending on, even the worst recession, is food. And Latin America can produce lots of that. So that makes it a very strategic region. So I think it's a region that's going to have a very challenging time. I think particularly the higher interest rates are going to be very challenging for the region, but the opportunities have to do with the strategic value for the Western powers.
I almost thought you were going to end on a negative, but you brought it
No.
on. You're on a roll. You're on a roll, but then you got into. Okay. So, John.
Two quick points. The first, as Jonathan pointed out, Latin America has shown a track record of excellent monetary policy, and there's a Canadian story to this. Back in 1997, after the emerging market FX crisis, Canada set up a thing called the Toronto Centre, which is very little known. And it is the world-class #1 trainer of central bankers. And they focus on middle-income countries, and Latin America has been their biggest client base. And they have trained the mid-level technocrats in every every Latin American central bank. And the legacy of that training is really what we're seeing in terms of great policy making today. So that's a real. Canada doesn't talk about that. The Toronto Centre has always kept a low profile. They take relatively little money from governments, and I think that's been key to their independence. I want to talk a little bit about demographics. You know, Latin America is actually, the difference between wealthy and poor in Latin America has steadily improved for 30 years. It has nothing to do with government policy. It has nothing to do with trade. It has nothing to do with investment. It has everything to do with demographics. The fact is that poor people in Latin America, starting 30 years ago, decided to have fewer kids. They did that because women had to go to work because the structures of the economy and the support and subsidies were disappearing. And they went from 4 kids on average per household to 2, and in poor families, even less. When you have fewer poor people, the cost of labor goes up. Middle classes. That's what created the middle class in Europe in the 1920s and 30s, was a demographic shift. And so we've had steadily increasing middle class. That was upset by COVID. We're in the third political phase of the COVID disaster. And the second was economic, caused by lockdowns, very strict lockdowns in Latin America, that put the poorest people, 60% of Latin Americans, work in the informal market. They earn only cash. And those people went from earning 100 to earning 0 overnight. Meanwhile, the rest of us kept the same salary working from Zoom from our homes. And that completely ended temporarily this steady improvement in poverty. And that's why people are pissed off and voting for change. The problem with change is that you bring in people who have the greatest aspirations but have no experience, and they have to answer to an angry mob. Castillo understood within 3 weeks of becoming president that he had to be supportive of mining, but he couldn't because his most ardent supporters wouldn't let him. And that's the risk. I agree with all the 30,000-foot optimism about Latin America, but the money classes in Latin America right now are more scared than I've ever seen them because the people in power do not speak the same language as them. They don't understand each other, and the people in power are bringing up old political models and political speak that hasn't been spoken in leadership circles in Latin America for 40 years. It's old Cold War, left-right conversations. And the money class is scared. Yes, they can make money in bonds in their own country with the real interest rates in Brazil are the highest in the world, but their core businesses, the stuff that that they invest in every day, they're worried too. Now, where does that leave us? I agree with all the optimism in terms of how global geopolitics and economics are favoring Latin America, but there's the risk of political interference is real. So if you invest in areas where there's little political interference, if you invest in consumer-facing businesses in Latin America, I think that's a really smart play for the next 10 years. The demographic shift, fastest aging population in the world, still has another 15, 20 years of good consumption. In other words, the population between 18 and 65 is still growing. Eventually, they'll become like Japan, and there'll be a lot of old people, and then that's a crisis 20 years from now Latin America has to deal with. But for the next 15 years, it's a great consumption story in Latin America. And any business related to that, particularly one that the politicians can't mess with too much, is a great play right now. But if you're in a highly regulated business that is a political football for whatever reason in that country, that's a real risk right now.
Thanks, John. We want to get to Brazil. Just to push back a little bit on John, maybe a bit of a contrarian opinion, is I think when you start to get a little bit more country by country analysis, I'm not sure that the analysis of COVID therefore equals poverty equals then the incumbent becomes unpopular. Piñera in Chile was vastly unpopular before COVID happened, and Duque was very much on the decline in Colombia happened. And so you could definitely make an argument just in those two countries alone that the change, as it were, in political orientation had a lot to do with the perceived, and some would say very real, incompetence and unresponsiveness of the executive at that time before that happened. The other point I would make about the money classes is, yeah, that's true in some of the, I agree, but what's interesting is when in conversations I have with people outside of those countries, including some of our stakeholders that we have, for example, around the election in Chile or the election in Colombia, they were a whole lot less concerned than the moneyed classes in those countries. And one is because the money classes in those countries, to use that term, just weren't used to having things exactly the way they wanted to go. Colombia is a perfect example. So there's definitely a
The guys
disconnect.
outside of the country already got their money out.
Yeah. Well, there's well, no, I mean, the foreign investors are still very much, so there's the real disconnect between what what some of them are feeling locally or say their fear, and what some major money from outside of those countries, the confidence or relative lack of unease is feeling towards those countries. But it's a conversation we always have. We need to move to Brazil. Thank you for that. I let it go longer because it was so engrossing, and I think hopefully enlightening for everybody listening. But we want to call on Melina now in Rio de Janeiro to talk a bit about Brazil, because there's been a few things going on in Brazil over the last several months. And Melina is an expert in political science, and also in the Igarapé they follow environmental matters very, very closely as well. So Melina, maybe you could tell us a little bit, summary, what your view of where Brazil is going this year.
All right. Thank you, Ken. I hope everyone hear me well. Okay, great. So I'll just start from the environmental perspective, because I think we are changing the sign, and all the signs that the new president gave to everyone, included copy, we saw that we are going to change the perspective. And this is really, really good and important as we see moving forward, including with the new Minister of Environmental in Brazil. We do have a really a good track record to decrease deforestation. That is a really key problem in Brazil facing in the global perspective. We've been studying what is going on in the Amazon, and the perspective has changed a lot. Everything that is happening in the now, it's much harder than we see in the previous year. So all the signs are in the correct direction, but we do have some challenges. When we see in the government perspective, in all the areas, what we see, it's like the green economy, it's going to flourish. We are going to see a lot of energy from the government to change, but we really need to have this whole comprehension about what is going on. And about the political perspective, everyone saw what happened in Brazil. We have a really high polarized society at this moment. So it's not going to be an easy term for President Lula. We have a really high polarized, really high divided society. And what we are seeing, it's the most extreme rioters that we saw in Sunday. They came from the Amazon. So this is going to be a really challenge that the government has to deal with. And to see and to put everyone in the same direction. So we need to pacify the country, and we have a lot of challenges to face and to see the perspective. I'm optimistic, cautiously optimistic, to see what is going on moving forward. All the directions that we see since Sunday are in the right position, but it's really important to understand that we face a really polarized and divided country at this moment.
Melina, do you think that the recent political events actually strengthens Lula's hand and position, or does it weaken it generally, and even with respect to the ambitious climate change plans that he has?
I really think it's strengthened. We just saw a poll that was launched yesterday evening that we see more than 90% of the population is against what we saw on Sunday. So it really is strengthened the position of President Lula, but he has to take this opportunity to do the changes that he has to face. So it's not going to be easy, but I think we have all the means, because at this moment, all the powers, they are really, they were brought together. There is this big coalition that one thing that we saw, it's like the strengthening and the union of civil society and all the powers that are having Brazil at this moment. So I think we have a really great opportunity to change the perspective that we see.
And can we expect this year from Marina Silva, the environmental climate change minister, a comprehensive package on climate change, or will it be just a series of laws and actions that is taken at certain intervals?
What we saw in the last 4 years was that a completely dismantle of the environmental policy that we have. So there is a lot of things to put in place. The three of the executive orders that were signed in the first day of President Lula was to try to rebuild part of this policy. So they just recover the command and control plan that we have so we can reduce deforestation. They just take off all the dismantle that the environmental agency has to deal and to face and to fight illegalities and environmental crimes. So this has been a really key point. And also we have new ministries that are going to put at least the indigenous people in the front line and the importance that they need, especially in the protection of the environment that we need at this moment. So I think it's going to be a comprehensive, but it's not without challenge. So I think she has to take this opportunity and to see this in the whole government approach. That is what we need at this moment in terms of the environmental and the climate change perspective.
Thank you, Melina. Okay, stay with us, please, of course. I'm going to ask Jonathan and Fiona also any comments or back and forth, not just what Melina said, but your own views of Brazil. And then I think it would be a good time to also go out to the audience for questions, particularly on Brazil, because I imagine one or two of you may have questions on Brazil before we lose Melina. So let's start. So if you want to ask a question, please put your hand up. Marta can get the mic to you. In the meantime, Jonathan, comments on Brazil.
Yeah. Look, the events of Sunday were obviously very disconcerting, and as was just said, the polarization in Brazil is intense. I would say the polarization is not a Brazilian phenomenon alone. It is an equal opportunity menace. It is as clear in Michigan as it is in Manaus. So, that's something we have to keep in mind. The world has experienced a change. We can have our own pet theories as to why. I think it has a little bit to do with the sort of direct-to-consumer politics of today through social media, which in Brazil was revolutionized really by Bolsonaro, but it is present everywhere. It's present in Canada. We saw that with the convoy protests in this country. So let's not point fingers. But this is a very disconcerting outcome, and I think it has quite a bit to do with what John was saying in terms of the resurgence of real poverty in Brazil, in a very unequal country. Having said that, I think that that was a very bad day for Bolsonaro and for the far right, and I don't think it's retrievable. So it strengthens Lula's hand, but it also raises the bar in terms of how to manage a situation, which is, I think, one that Lula wasn't necessarily bred for as a political leader. So the question is, can he find an operating framework as a politician and as a leader to deal with these new constructions and new phenomena in politics? The last thing I would say is, I don't expect that this kind of thing will happen again in Brazil in this way. I think that these natural rhythms and global phenomena, they resonate with each other. I think in the United States, for example, which clearly was an inspiration, I hope was only an inspiration as opposed to actually being funded, but it was an over-rotation or an overshoot that I think, like Marlo looking over the cliff, it's like, I think I've had enough. And I think the Brazilian people are basically saying that, most of them. And that's a very powerful message and a very powerful moment. And I think that will be seared in the national psyche. Brazilians are not politically violent people. I mean, they had a military coup and nobody got killed. I mean, it's not a place where that, I think, is part of the national sort of narrative. The thing about the question of political leadership is that I just would say that this is where we begin to see the limitations of the lack of party discipline and the lack of sort of real political development in a country like Brazil, with the Central and with the sort of fragmented politics. This is where it really matters. This kind of thing doesn't happen in countries with healthy political parties. And I do think that that's something that we will be talking about more and more going forward.
Thanks, Jonathan. And just for those who don't know, we've done a series of events on Brazil over the last year, one particularly on the political dynamics of the Central that Jonathan talked about. We did one on environmental, and we did one on fake news in Latin America, which or disinformation in Latin America. And one of the panelists on it was the manager of Lula's digital platform for his presidential campaign, who had some interesting things to say from their perspective. So that's all of it is on our website at ccacanada.com for those who want to find it. Thank you, Jonathan. Fiona, you may want to touch on some of the economic aspects.
Sure. Yeah. Just on sort of what's happened first recently in Brazil. I do agree with Jonathan, but I would qualify that. I'm slightly more negative. I do think that obviously this strengthens Lula's hand in the short term, and that we won't see something of this scale happening again. But I do think we have to recognize that even without Bolsonaro, we have Bolsonarismo, we have a conservative right-wing movement in Brazil. We will continue to have political polarization and fragmentation in Brazil, which is not good for the health of the political system. And we could have some, in terms of operational risk, although we won't see the scale of violence that we saw previously, we might see, there are, threats to block access to oil refineries or block roads. So we could see more of that. And that could become sort of economically disruptive and problematic for Lula's administration. And then more broadly in our view on Brazil, I always say that, under Lula, we're really not too worried about the outlook for Brazil under Lula. We think that there are a couple of really good things that will be happening under Lula, and that is sort of a re-engagement with the international community on the environment and Amazon deforestation. That will be great, among other things. Maybe that could get some more impetus for EU-Mercosur, which I think would be of benefit all around. We also think that there will be a successful tax reform that will go some way to reducing the complexity of Brazil's tax system. So the Custo Brazil, also sort of revenue raising, and we've seen that. So this is the regional trend and global trend that I didn't get a chance to mention, which is sort of the rise of the big state with voters, ever since COVID and then Russia, Ukraine. Voters quite reasonably are demanding sort of more government support over the longer term. So you need, if you're not going to consolidate elsewhere, sort of raise revenue. And we saw that we've seen that in Chile, we've seen that in Colombia, and we think that we'll see that in Brazil. And partly because Lula will have a little bit more support now, we do think that will happen. So that's positive. Just for investors, I guess the negative, for example, would be sort of the privatization agenda sort of coming to a bit of a halt. We'll continue to see sort of, for example, port concessions. We'll still see a delay with that probably as Lula's team sort of reviews everything. So, and then just to finish on sort of the downside risk is around fiscal and the fiscal framework. We know that the current fiscal rule is going to be abandoned and replaced with something else. So I think investors are really concerned with seeing what that is replaced with, and it needs to be credible and rules-based. So that is sort of a risk to the economy. And then the upside risk would be like greater than expected progress on those productivity and growth boosting reforms. We're not that optimistic about that, partly because what we've been talking about the difficulties of the political system and how even though we think that Lula will more or less, governability won't be too bad, it won't be great either, and we'll see the usual resort to pork barrel politics on an ad hoc basis to get things done, which means sort of in Brazil, as ever, it's actually hard to get anything done.
Thank you. I know other people on the panel have something to say, but if you wouldn't mind, because we're going to come to Mexico right after this. And I know all three of you have Melina, I don't know if you have any comments on what you've heard, or we should go to a few questions from the audience. Do you have any comments from what you've heard so far?
What I see, it is, I don't, as the other panelists, I don't believe that we are going to see the same thing that we saw on Sunday. I think the government is more prepared, and they are responding in the highly, they are responding correctly to see and to seek and to investigate all the chain of command, including who is financing, who is operating, all the financing to the riots that we saw on Sunday. So this is something that is going to, I think, to be more calmer, but it's not going away. As we see, there is a lot of people. They've been in front of the army in every place of the country since the election results. So the credibility of democracy, it's really high in Brazil among part of the population. And I really think we have to conquer, to get this back and to see democracy, it's really strong, and it's the only way to move forward in a really strong country.
Okay, thank you, Melina. Questions? I think I said, okay, yeah, Larry has a question.
Thank you, Larry Herman, Cassidy, Levy, Kent, Washington. First of all, Ken, I want to commend you for all of the things you've done to improve Canadian relations with Latin America. You've been a stalwart for many years, and I congratulate you for all the work you've done. And I commend Denton's for what they're doing in terms of Canada, Latin America, business relations. This was one of the best panels I've heard about Latin.
It's not the best, just one of the best.
It's the best. It's the best. I'll give you that.
Okay,
I'll
you
give
can
that.
continue
No,
then. Okay.
It was terrific. All of you were wonderful, and you illuminated a lot of the issues. But I wanted to ask the panelists, what do you see as impediments to improving Canadian business relations with Latin America? And what are the solutions? What would you propose to dismantle those impediments, or what could be done to make Canadian business more aware of the opportunities that you've talked about, leaving aside the political risk element? But what are some of the practical ideas to give Canadian business a better entree into the Latin American economy?
Thank you, Larry. That exact point that's the grand finale. So we can't even give a peek now because it'll ruin the grand finale. But we will get to that. So thank you for that question.
Because I think at the end of the day, that's what we're all talking about.
That's exactly why we're building up that to that crescendo, and we will get to that. Thank you for that question. Is there anything specific on Brazil? Yes, please.
I'm Esteban Duarte. I'm a reporter for Bloomberg News. Basically, it would be interesting to know what or when do you see or where do you see that debate about the spending rule ending? At some point, I think maybe 1 or 2 weeks ago, Lula said that the expenditure rule is not useful anymore or something like that. So wonder, after Sunday's events, I don't know if that room of maneuver for the government is as wide as it was previously, or what is the take that you have on that?
Okay, so the question is on spending rule in Brazil. Eduardo, is that something that you
I actually spent a big part of yesterday discussing that with clients. I think Lula can't afford to scrap the spending rule. I think he actually has to go in the opposite direction. I think global interest rates are going to rise. The last 10 years, were abnormal in the world in that we had 10-year treasuries average 1.7. Financial theory says that, and I think history of the world also says the same thing, that if you're a risk-free rate, you have to preserve capital. That means you have to keep up with the pace of the nominal economy. So 2% growth, 2% inflation, 4% fair value 10-year treasuries, which means Brazil has a beta over that, a spread over that. My guess is we see Brazilian interest rates settle somewhere around 10% on average, which means that if you have 100% gross public debt to GDP, you're going to spend 10% of your income paying interest payments. You on top of that spend 12% of GDP paying pensions, which means you're spending a fifth of national income paying things that will never produce anything in the future. Lula has to go in the absolute other direction, and the time that Brazil has is smaller than other places in Latin America, among other things, because the average life of Brazilian debt is only 4 years versus 12 in Peru and 8 in Mexico, which means the time you have between interest rates reset at a higher level is relatively low. So I think Brazil has to understand that there's a very strong urgency in that. We're going to get a little bit of relief, which is the opportunity to take that step, because if the US goes into recession next year, we'll likely have a brief drop in interest, but that's already discounted in markets. You already have inverted curves, and that inverted curve is what Brazil has to start taking advantage to find room for something else. So my experience is that Lula is a pragmatic person. I used to work in the Mexican Treasury in the early 2000s, and I remember that back then people were terrified. Emerging markets were still something people were starting to understand. And my job, I ran the Investor Relations Department office for the Mexican government back then, was diversification. Every time people from New York would come, it was diversification. We're not like them, they're going to blow up, not us. Reality is Brazil didn't blow up. Lula was a very pragmatic leader. He did his job well. And I think Lula understands that when pressure is there, he does the right thing. That's my expectation.
Can I add just one
Please,
little comment
please.
on transactional politics, let's call it that. The Americans call it pork barrel. In Latin America, we call it corruption. But the fact is that most legislation requires elbow grease, if you want to call it that. In Brazil, they're much more open about it, and it's just being cash. But that changed, and there was very strict laws brought in to try to reduce that. But I had a really interesting conversation. I was on a boat, and one of the people on the boat was an well, I won't name this person, but it was in the Temer administration. And I asked this person, we don't talk about it because Bolsonaro was such a buffoon, but there was such amazing progress made in terms of reforms in Brazil between the Temer administration and the Bolsonaro administration, things that people have been calling for 30 years. And so I asked, and as well as privatizations, and I asked, would these be undone, by a new administration? And he said, those privatizations, about 20% of the money was put aside for consulting contracts, and everybody was paid off, including people in the PT. He said, so don't worry, nobody's going to reverse that. And that is one of the benefits of transactional politics, is that everybody who might upset things gets paid off. And I know it sounds really cynical, but it actually is an important mechanism of continuation from one administration to the next. We tend to, in Latin America, put so much emphasis on the change at the presidency. We fail to understand the mechanics of legislation. And the fact is that Lula, I think, will be frustrated by an ideological change, different course that he wants to set, but between the Central that demands money and a center-right Congress that ideologically is differently minded, without much money, and no government in Latin America has money right now, will he be able to change or undo a lot of the sort of progressive reforms, and I say economically progressive reforms that were done? So I have a lot of Brazilian friends, and they're freaking out because they weren't necessarily Bolsonaristas, but they're more anti-Lula. Yeah. But I tell them, between the market and politics, he is penned in, and there's only so much he can do, and he doesn't have the global resource boom that he had when he was first in power to spend his way to change. He will not have the money to change things legislatively in Brazil. For that reason, I think there will be a lot of tinkering at the regulatory level, But I think real legislation change or going back on things is the business mindset should feel comfortable with what's going on.
John, I know you. I'll let you in a second. Melina, any comments on anything that you've heard in the latest comments?
No.
Okay, great.
Fair enough.
Fair enough.
Yeah,
Jonathan.
no, very briefly, I would just say, just picking up on John's comments, which I very much agree with, this is all about retail politics. And so it really matters who's sitting in the presidential palace. And so the question, going back to my comments previously, is how is Lula going to, as being penned in, and I agree with your analysis, is how to manage the optics and how to manage the political messaging. And I think Lula's quite good at that, actually, if I may say. I think he's actually probably better than any politician in Latin America right now. And it really matters, particularly after Sunday. It really matters. I mean, he did the things that you should do as a statesperson in the face of this kind of crisis on Sunday. Jail in Brazil is not fun, from what I hear. So, hundreds of people going to jail. They're not going to do it again, okay? So, he acted in the appropriate way, but it's really about the retail politics. So I actually think on the fiscal rule that there will be a loosening of the fiscal rule because there's actually a consensus in even Faria Lima that it's a bit clunky. So even, Arminio Fraga thinks that they should loosen the fiscal rule, which is a remarkable statement. The question is how? And I think it'll be a lot of hand waving and not a lot of content, but they will ostensibly loosen the fiscal rule without loosening fiscal policy. That's what I expect.
So, did you want to come in on this one, or do you want to? We're going to Mexico in a second. Okay. Again, this is another segment we could keep going on with. I think we need to bring this to a close at this point and move on to Mexico. Melina, thank you so much for your contributions, and I know you carved out time in the middle of a very busy agenda. So I think we've kept to our promise to you to terminate, to end the Brazil section by now. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much, and have a good session.
Okay, so let's move on to another country that's always in the news, in particular the last few days because of the meetings that have been going on between I really hate the term three amigos, the leaders of North America. I really do hate it. And we're blessed with tremendous amount of Mexican expertise on the panel and people here as well. Let me start with you, Solange. Politically, what should we be looking out for in the year ahead in Mexico?
Well, it is not easy because I want to go back with what you were saying about Brazil because it helped me with the explanation for Mexico. We have been seeing this divided governments. So we have a president from one party and the Congress is from the majority of the Congress from another party. So in the case of, for example, Brazil, it is sometimes it is a paradox because it creates gridlocks. It creates a paralysis in the government. So many policies got stuck in the Congress. That's the negative side. But in the case of Mexico, it has been positive because what we have seen in the first 2 years of the Mexican administration under AMLO, he didn't want to make constitutional changes that have been happening in Latin America in the last years. These changes similar to what Chavez in Venezuela or Evo Morales in Bolivia did. He didn't want to do that in the first 2 years for different reasons, but he didn't do that even though he had the majority, enough majority in the Congress to make it. So what we have seen is that after the 2021 election, the midterm elections, in the Congress, he didn't have the majority now to make constitutional changes. So it has been very difficult for him to push his own agenda and his own policies because he doesn't have this majority. So he has been pushing for changes, particularly in energy, because it is a very close topic for him. Particularly in energy topics, he has been pushing like in beside the Constitution, so violating the Constitution in many ways. And what we are going to see in the next 2 years, it is a radicalization, a polarization of his positions, because he is not going to win in the Supreme Court. He has been rejected. His candidate to be the president of the Supreme Court was rejected. What you know about that? It was a very, very huge scandal. He plagiarized his bachelor thesis, and it was very, very bad. So he lost that, and he doesn't have now the moment in the Supreme Court that he wanted. So the Supreme Court is not going to back his policies, and so what we are going to see is his Ministry of Interior doing what he knows best, which is violate the Constitution and violate the rules if he needed to push the agenda. So we are going to see more radical positions from his government. And
On specific, can you cite some specific issues where you think we'll see that?
yeah, in energy, for example, we see in the Three Amigos Summit. Sorry, North Latin American
you can
Summit.
say it, that's
yeah,
fine.
I
that's
hate
fine.
it too. In the summit, we see this all these smiles, and after what Trudeau said in Friday, we expected in Mexico that it will be like a kind of tensions between this meeting. And at the end of the day, we just see protocol, diplomacy winning all the headlines in the newspapers. But behind the scenes, there is a lot of pressure, and AMLO is not going back in energy issues. That is a fact. It doesn't matter what Canada or USA. He's not going back in that topic. So in the case of climate change, for example, Mexico is under his commitments in Paris Agreement, and he doesn't care. So energy, I think, and agricultural, GMO, those topics help him with the narrative, the nationalistic narrative he need to push for an electoral environment positive for his party, for Morena. So I think in those matters we are going to see more radicalizations in the narrative of AMLO.
Thank you. John, you like to talk about politics and economics. Well, you both do. So, Eduardo, go ahead. You take over. Anything about Mexico? You want, obviously, economics and politics, and then John, of course, you come after.
I'll go away from politics, and so John can wrap everything up. For me, the most interesting thing in Mexico right now is that for the fourth time in my professional life, Mexico is supposed to have a miracle. When I was when I became an adult, we were going to become Canada in 1994 because NAFTA was going to bring Mexico up to become a superpower. I'm still waiting for that one. I still feel there's a difference between Mexico City and Toronto. Second time in my life, in my career in government, we had the structural reforms under Fox that were going to make Mexico grow at 7%. I'm still waiting for that one. I don't think we even hit 7% 1 year. Third time in my career, we had the Mexico 2 minutes with the reforms under Peña Nieto, and now nearshoring is supposed to be for the fourth one.
The Mexico City food scene is really good.
That's very good.
That's right.
No, and what I wanted to say is that I don't think any of those previous three miracles or the current one are complete failures. If you took a car and you drove from San Diego to Belize 40 years ago, and you do the same drive today, the Mexico you find is dramatically different. 40 years ago, modern Mexico ended after 2 hours of driving. Today, you get to Puebla, and you see, as Jonathan was saying, amazing industrial parks. One of the failures of Mexico is that we turn a bunch of countries into two very polarized and vastly different countries. And I think it's part of what Jonathan was alluding to in the global populism rise. We had a world where globalization turned a bunch of income distributions that were up here in the developed world and down here in the emerging world into one big one. That meant that the jobs from Detroit destroyed the middle class in Detroit, but created the middle class in Mexico. Globalization tends to do those things. Mexico is a country where if you go to the north, you think you're in Texas. You drive hours and you find massive industrial parks. There's access to power. There's access to massive numbers of engineers. Mexico is the 7th country in the world that produces the most engineers. And they're actually very smart young kids, because 12 years ago they were studying industrial and civil engineering. Today, 56% of engineering graduates are studying technology and renewable energy related engineering. So there's that very dynamic Mexico that's super adapted to global supply chains and is quite strong in them. But then you have another half of the country which has been contracting at 7% rate for 40 years. The problem with that, and why I'm somewhat skeptical of this fourth miracle, is that you can only create as many factories as there's power to run them. You can only create enough factories as there's qualified labor to run them. You can only create enough agro-industrial businesses as you have water to run them. And reality is our capacity to absorb nearshoring is capped. If you look at the US market share in imports, China has lost 5 percentage points of US imports since 2016. 44% of that has gone to Vietnam, 22% to Canada, and about 10% each to Mexico, India, and Taiwan. So we're tied in 3rd place. If you look at investment, there's massive investment going on, and if you are sitting in Monterrey or Mexicali, you have a transformation. But if reality is the index with which investment is measured in Mexico is 2013 equals 100, and the last print we have is 99.2. So we're below 2013 aggregate levels of investment. The reality is, like other countries in the world, Mexico is a country where you have half of the country, sectors and regions, growing at 7%, and you have half the country contracting at 7%. Until the country develops a broader and better public education, better institutions for security in the whole country, not just in half of it, better access to power, we will continue to have that problem. So I don't want to say that this doom is stuck in here. I don't want to say that Mexico is not going to have a fourth miracle. To some degree, half of Mexico has seen one 3 times, and is going to see a fourth one. I don't think Mexico is going to become a 7% growth rate, no. But reality is most businesses don't make money based on GDP. The only investment I know that pay coupons based on GDP performance are the Argentine bonds from the 2002 restructuring. And that's a very small niche for my clients.
Thank you, Eduardo. John, please.
Last night I was walking, I think we were walking for dinner, and there was a billboard, and it said, Trudeau expects Mexico to, take a reasonable position on energy reform. And I almost tripped and fell into the street when I saw it. Once again, our Prime Minister has shown his naivete in international affairs. But to understand how disruptive AMLO is and what he means for Mexico, you have to understand the arc of Mexican history going back to the revolution. You had one party that got reelected for 70 years. It was, as the Peruvian novelist called it, the perfect dictatorship. And Mexico almost invented the hybrid of democratic autocracy. And they perfected it in the sense that every 6 years, they convinced the people who had risen to the top and were making a killing to walk away and go move to Spain and live in retirement, and we won't bother you, just get out of the way. The only way you can do that is if you're constantly generating lots of money to distribute to that political class, to convince them to walk away. And they know that they're going to bank for 6 years and then they're going to walk away and that's it. AMLO was new to, he was raised, his entire North Star politically was formed in the 1970s when oil prices were high and when the PRI had this perfect hybrid democratic autocracy working. And he wanted to reconstruct that. And that's been his plan from the beginning. And it means how do you tax Latin or Mexico? He started with the Fondo Minero, 7.5% royalties that go to local communities around Mexico, mining communities. He grabbed that and he used it to fund Morena candidates in all of the states to create a national party where Morena was really only a factor in about half of the states in Mexico. He then realized that energy reforms, which were took an amazing political navigation to put in place, but were piping in American gas, the cheapest natural gas, the cheapest in the world, to create gas-powered power generation in the north, which is absolutely essential to the development of Mexico as a manufacturing hub. Mexican industrial electricity costs 75% more than it does in Texas. And the energy reform was going to be the mechanism to bring that down. But CFE, the state monopoly that produces electricity, produces it more expensively than these new plants and a lot more dirtily. They were losing contracts. And so he came in and basically scrapped the energy reform to protect CFE, okay? And more recently scrapped distributed generation, which is the smaller scale generation that also energy reform allowed, that if you're a factory and you create your own generation, you can sell the surplus into the grid. And people thought, okay, if we have distributed generation, we can still move forward with this nearshoring miracle. Well, that's being taken off the table. He is trying to create a powerful enough state that can guarantee re-election every 6 years. The problem is that he doesn't have, at his age, he simply doesn't have the charisma, nor possibly even the physical capability to pull off that kind of a retransformation of politics in light of an internet-facing, hyper-democratic information age that we live in. In the olden days, through PIPSA, the state enterprise, you controlled the import of pulp and paper, and therefore you controlled the print in Mexico. You had a couple of television channels, and you were responsible for 60% of advertising, so you controlled TV. Those days are gone. And this is the train wreck that Mexico's in right now. On the one hand, geopolitically, it's incredibly blessed, right? Nearshoring is the obvious place. And the export economy of Mexico, which is driven by engineering talent, driven by great training, driven by amazing infrastructure that moves into at least half of Mexico. The export economy of Mexico is being booming for 30 years. It's the domestic economy, which is the voter base, which is driven by government spending and by domestic investment, that's in trouble. And although foreign investors were very slow to realize what was going on with AMLO, Mexican investors weren't. And well over $100 billion of Mexican wealthy money has left. It's gone to Texas, it's gone to Spain, it's gone to Miami, it's gone to New York, it's gone to other parts of the world. And this is the dichotomy in Mexico. And it's always been a dichotomy ever since NAFTA. But you have an external economy that's doing really well and a domestic economy that continues to be punished by, I mean, in Brazil, they call it custo brasileiro. They haven't come up with a term in Mexico, but they certainly could. So again, you've got very stable currency, a good consumer base, and I go back to my early comments. If your business is consumer focused, if you're part of that consumer base and you're also earning in pesos, it's probably a good business. If it's regulatory driven, where there's political interference, because AMLO is not just ideologically bent on this plan. He fired all the competent technocrats, and there was a lot of really competent technocrats in Mexico, and they're all gone. And the people who replace them are by and large incompetent. And so even the stuff like getting a permit, starting a business, it used to be easy to start a business in Mexico. Now it's a lot tougher. So the micro level of governing in Mexico has also broken down. Again, it doesn't affect you if you're a foreign investor and you're putting a plant. Apple's putting this huge plant. I guarantee you there was no incompetence there. But if you're starting a small business in Mexico, that's where the issue is. So again, the dichotomy between external Mexico and internal Mexico has never been stronger than it is right now. And it'll be curious to see. I think Morena will win the next election, but I think, depending on who the candidate is, it could be a very different blueprint. Because AMLO's ability, he's no Putin, his ability to sort of control the things once he makes his dedazo, I don't think he'll be able to do much in the next decennium. So there is hope that the next Morena government will be quite different.
Thank you. Solange, briefly, and we have a few things to cover. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Just wanted to build on what John said, and three things important in the case of Mexico. One is the militarization of the government. AMLO has been giving a lot of parts of the administration, airports, now an airline, customs, to the military. So he's strengthening the militaries, and he's creating a kind of loyalty from the soldiers. So it is important because in the case of Mexico, different to what happened in most Latin American countries, Mexico didn't have a military coup never. After the revolution, the National Party was a very, very, very creative idea on how to stop all the violence and the militarization in the country. So they just put the militaries under the lead of a civil president. So it works for many years. So that is a very important risk in the case of Mexico in the coming years, because no matter who is going to be in the power, I agree with John that Morena will win the next elections, not just because Morena, but because we don't have a strong opposition that can win any election, not domestic election, neither presidential election. So not just because Morena, but also for the next president and for the coming presidents after that one, this will be a very huge risk, having the militia being very strong. Second thing is that AMLO has been destroying all the institutional structure in Mexico. So what John said is true. It is now we don't have competent civil servants, but we have a lot of loyal servants in the government, and that is also true for the ones that are going to organize the next election. So it will be not budget for independent election organizations. The INE, it has been under attack since 2018 and before that, and we will see the militia, and we will see this internal group in the government, the nation's servants, the servidores de la nación, doing a lot of the job that INE used to do. So 2024 election will be very, very they will not have a lot of credibility. And my last point is, Morena will win, but what we need to take account in is that Morena is not free. And this is important because the previous party that governed Mexico for 70 years was a corporate party. And what this means that the party was organized under different groups. There were the private sector group. There were the agricultural group. There were all these sectors create a very good structure to continue dealing with issues, but inside the party. that's why pre-function, and that was very helpful for the party to keep the power for all those years. But Morena is not that. Morena is not a corporate party. It's a social movement, and it's breaking down, and it's having a lot of troubles inside, and it doesn't have these good relations inside, and it doesn't have these corporate groups. So that's why I said, if Morena wins the next election, it's not because Morena, it is because the opposition is not strong enough, not because Morena is strong.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean,
Sorry.
It's interesting to note that there's not a credible opposition, right? And there are reasons why there's not a credible opposition, not just because Morena is strong or whatever, right? And we don't have time to get into that, but it's talk about the failures or the bankruptcy or of the system came before AMLO, right? So, I know Jonathan, Fiona, you want to jump in really, really quickly? No, that's okay.
Just super
Okay.
quick, just to mention, there is something happening in Mexico. It's all very doom and gloom. You can look at the U.S. Customs data, and you can see that Mexico's share of U.S. imports vis-a-vis the entire Pacific Rim has grown pretty consistently over the course of the past 5 years. So, there is some opportunity, and Mexico's, ties to the U.S. and the fact that it's part of the USMCA puts a little bit of a floor under the outlook. But that said, obviously, it is missing a golden opportunity. And apart from everything else that John, Solange, and Eduardo have been saying, it's missing out because there's a lack of sort of proactive engagement with Mexico's USMCA partners, and a lack of recognition that we've returned to industrial policy, right, on semiconductors, EVs, creating that semiconductor ecosystem. Maybe we'll see if something better comes out of the Three Amigos Summit, but I'm not super optimistic about that. And that means that Mexico looks likely to be resigned to the internal combustion engine, and it should be moving on. And we see in the US, we see chips, and we also see there were some incentives in chips for the US's USMCA partners, and those incentives have gone to Canada, not to Mexico. So Mexico is really falling behind there. We'll see what happens. Tesla, everyone's speculating that it's about to announce a gigafactory in Mexico. It hasn't yet. It's announced an expansion of Texas. So I don't know. I don't have any insider information there. Maybe that will give us like a little hint of what sort of the business perspective is. But it is really missing out because it's not, apart from all of the issues around energy and water and overall sort of deterioration of institutions, there's a lack of coordination on what its USMCA partners have in common.
Thank you, Fiona. I want to go to the two countries now that we mentioned earlier, that have shaken things up a bit with the elections over the last 12 months. Well, I guess the Chilean one was within 12 months, more or less. Chile and Colombia. So let's start with Chile on that. Jonathan,
Sure.
Chile.
Not to turn this into a history lesson, but I actually think that Chile presents a very important case as we think about the next number of years, because history really matters. Just as it matters in Mexico, the antecedents matter a lot in Chile as well. Chile has a unique profile, not just in Latin America, but I would say actually globally, because it's one of the few countries that went on a development path that neither followed the Asian model of development nor the American model of development. It had its own model, or even a Brazilian model of development, which is a very, very strong state, or the Mexican one with a very weak state. So what was it, and why does it matter? So Chile had a massive change from military dictatorship to democracy, to the great leadership that those individuals who led it procured. But they didn't change basically the political economy of the country. It was a constitution that remained. It was a constitution that was Pinochet's constitution, which was based on the notion that you privatize and decentralize the economy because it's more efficient, because that's what Milton Friedman said. And it actually never shifted. So unlike, say, Taiwan or South Korea, which place a huge amount of emphasis on development economics and welfare of individuals, not freedom, but the welfare of individuals and development of their human capital, development of their social capital. That's not what Chile did. Chile's percent of GDP devoted to social spending was one of the lowest in the OECD, one of the lowest actually in Latin America, surprisingly. But its economic dynamism and productivity was very high. So it's a dilemma. And that dilemma essentially is what led to the events of 2019 and to the events of the elections and the Constitutional Assembly election or referendum that took place. So this is normalization time. That's what's happening in Chile. I think this is the way we think about it, or should think about it. You had a gap that was growing. In a way, Chile is a victim of its own success. It created a lot of economic growth and a lot of productivity, but a whole echelon of people are saying, I really don't feel like this is fair. And it costs a lot to do everything, because everything costs, because it's a more decentralized, more privatized economy than any other in Latin America. And so it costs a lot to get on the subway, or the bus or the subway. It costs a lot to go to school. It costs a lot to get a school uniform. It costs a lot to get the books. It costs a lot to go to the hospital. It costs a lot to do everything. So the balance has now come in place. And that's really how you have to look at the protests, which, by the way, were not the first protests. I mean, we had protests well back in the Bachelet government. We've seen those before, and Piñera's government, the interim government. And we also have to see that in and why the Constitution turned out the way it did. So I'll just make three statements. The first is that the constitutional reform has gone in a way the way, as investors, you kind of want it to. The first effort was a bad effort, okay? I think the intentions were very, very positive and good, but it wasn't even like a crazy socialist constitution. It just didn't make a lot of sense. There was stuff in there that didn't make sense. And the people who were well-intentioned, probably the majority of them, who were put in that assembly weren't probably the right people. And so, as Ken, you've always said, in Chile, two things happened: sensibility and the center held. Right?
You said that?
You did. Okay. And so when we faced an election between Kast and Boric, the center held, which is true of Chilean politics, I think, broadly speaking, and the history of Chile, with obvious moments of exception, and the sense and sensibility of Chileans during the vote in the referendum also came through, saying, I don't think this is going to work. And they were right. But what is going to work is the fact that now this constitutional process, which with 24 experts sitting there, which is a significant minority of the people around the table, and finding that the population is not really there for a radical shift on a number of fronts, social, economic, and political, we're probably going to get a reasonable outcome. And that's good for investors. First thing. Second thing is, so what about this government? And are we going to find our way to some kind of synthesis or normalization that's going to be positive? I mean, I think there are some risks, to be very honest, for many of the reasons that Eduardo has mentioned and that you had mentioned, John. Polarization is high in Chilean politics. It's actually a bit queasy making, to be honest, as someone who's been going there for 30 years. And it's going to have to cope in a different economic environment with higher general rates and interest rates, and with a more complex geopolitical environment. And Chile does have to kind of dance between China and the United States because it's their biggest customer. The 37% of copper in the world is produced there, and most of it goes to China. So that's an important thing. Having said that, the Chile of Boric today has a few features which probably can give us some comfort. The first is policymaking is not radical. As it was at our event in Ottawa last year that Gabriel Boric said the following, and I actually think he's right. He said, I'm not a radical. I'm interested in human rights. And I think that's essentially what they've shown themselves to do. They may not be that experienced, which is a risk.
Consistent about it, about human rights.
Yeah, very well through
regardless
his
of
whole
spectrum,
life.
political
Exactly.
spectrum.
But inexperience is something that can be dealt with, and the solution is usually called experience. Radicalism and a sort of a very rigid socialist view is something you can't really fix. So I think that's one thing. The other thing is the policy frameworks, just like the comments I made about the unique way that Chile developed, the policy frameworks are a little out of date too. And so there's this thing called an AFP, so a pension. So we have pensions here. Ours are rather good, I think. The AFP was a very, very orthodox economic construction in Chile. It was very, very, very Chicago style. And the truth is, if you took it out of Chile and you put it in some other country like Belgium, they'd say, what kind of crazy process is this? Like, why would you do it this way? But because it came out of the political, crucible of Chilean politics, the AFP was highly politicized, both from the criticism side and from the defense side. And what's happened, I think, is that they've been able to focus on this in a more objective way. And I think the policy process, by the way, which was begun by Piñera himself to fix it, which is to introduce a public option and to make it more widely distributed, is actually going to be on the margin more successful than I think most people think. All is to say that Chilean politics has changed forever. The social framework has changed forever. It'd probably be less productive going forward, but it's probably more stable.
Okay. Eduardo, maybe you want to talk a bit about the economics. Let me just put in another plug. For those that were interested in the constitutional process, not just the one that happened for the past year, but what's coming up. We did a series also on our website of 5, dealing with 5 specific issues in the new constitution: economic rights, property rights, indigenous rights, women's rights, and environmental rights, with constitutional experts from all over the world examining what was in that proposed Chilean constitution. And while that constitution did not pass, I can promise you that a lot of the ideas that surfaced through that process, you'll be hearing about again, and because they're already on the table. And so if you want background for what the thinking is from at least a pretty large sector in Chile about those issues, feel free to look at it on our website. Eduardo, briefly on the economics.
Super quick, because I think Jonathan already covered a lot of, like Jonathan, I'm going to make a super brief kind of historical precedent. I think the world right now, it looks a lot like it did in the 1920s. We went through a massive period of globalization. We start a period of deglobalization. Financial market integration is the only other time when the emerging markets were part of the global world. We had massive technological disruption. Back then we had planes, electric vehicles, telephones, moving information in a much, much faster way. And like then, I think governments failed to keep up with their ability to connect to people. We're seeing it now, only 17% of the world uses traditional media to get information, and people are having problem communicating with their citizens. Like then, we had a pandemic. The pandemic in both counts changed the social structure of the planet. Back then, it was a disproportionate amount of young men who died. Back then, it led to the start of women participation in the labor force. It led to people demanding more social security because they had felt vulnerable in the pandemic. And now I think we're starting to see some changes. We have the changes in work environments, people also feeling vulnerable and demanding more social security. And Chile, in that regard, I think is going to be somewhat of a laboratory for the world. Like Argentina, Uruguay, and the US were 100 years ago, Chile is a country that went from being a relatively low-income country into a fairly prosperous one without having social security. And that makes the debate in Chile of the citizens saying, well, I want more social services, very important. I think it's going to be an interesting debate for the rest of the world to follow, because what's happening in Chile now, I think is going to happen elsewhere. I think for Chile, the critical thing right now is not get, I think what Argentina got wrong in the previous stint. Argentina was a country as wealthy as Canada in the 1970s, and I think because it was too generous and not very, I would say, sustainable in how it designed its social structure and the incentives for the economy to remain productive with a larger state and more entitlements, it ultimately brought Argentina down. I think at this stage, Chile, and I think I agree with Jonathan, I think the government is being very proactive and very pragmatic in how the decisions are being made. It's one of the countries I feel fairly comfortable that it's taking the right decisions so that it doesn't fall into the excesses that we saw in Argentina earlier on, and which I think some countries in Latin America are sadly going in the wrong direction in. I worry a lot, for example, in Costa Rica. I think Costa Rica is going into the wrong path.
Anything positive?
No, I just said Chile is gonna.
No, I'm only kidding. I'm only kidding you. I'm only kidding you. Thank you.
I'm keeping a doom lossy here, I promise.
Well, we got something positive to say because we're coming to Colombia, and that you're happy about the Colombian coffee place that you found in 40 King Street. Right. Colombia, Fiona, and then we'll go to John. Oh, Solange, I'm sorry.
Sorry, just one brief comment about Chile. What my only concern in the case of Chile is the constitutional process, because Gabriel Boric has been using his political capital. He just used it for the first process, and now we have seen that the honeymoon has ended, and a second constitutional process for any government in the world is very, very challenging. So I am not I am concerned about how this process is going to end and how Boric will manage the rest of his administration after that.
Spending more political capital again on that process, and what's left to manage the other aspects of his, okay.
Exactly.
Great point, thank you. And sorry, I didn't see you.
No.
Colombia, Fiona.
Yeah, so we sort of have said, sort of looking towards 2023, that one of the key trends to look out for is what the new governments that were elected in that big election cycle in 2021 and 2022 were going to do. So the big challenge is not getting elected, it's actually governing. And you can see that you have instances where you have extreme polarization and a lack of negotiation and compromise, and that creates problems with governability, and Solange touched on that, and ultimately you have increased voter disillusionment, and then you sort of circle the drain towards populism and authoritarianism. I think Colombia is a very good example under Petro of a government that has done the opposite and that has been sort of a success in creating a working majority. And in order to do that, Petro has shifted towards the center. I think that that's a very good signal for what's to come in Colombia, and it has allowed Petro to make some progress on his agenda. So make some progress on tax reform, mentioned the big state before, that's important to Colombia as well. They do want to be able to spend more. Petro made a lot of promises to his supporters. So, we've seen that he's able to get some things done. How long will that last? I'm not optimistic that it will sort of last out the whole of Petro's term. I think that over the course of the next few years, as politicking increases, that we'll start to see sort of cracks in that coalition emerge. And also because it's difficult for Petro to tack to the center and maintain the support, for example, of the smaller left-wing parties, some of whom, for example, are upset with, at present, a political reform proposal. So it's hard for Petro to manage gaining the support of the center while keeping hold of his core base of supporters who have elected him on a platform of radical transformation and who might think that that's not what he's doing. So he's given up on that agenda. So I think that will be very sort of tricky looking forwards to watch out for in Colombia. Is sort of the situation I think is very, very positive at the moment in terms of governability. And I think that's sort of probably the most important thing in Colombia at the moment. But I don't think that will necessarily last.
Great. John.
I'm not so sanguine.
Yeah, I was going to say, you're sitting
Colombia.
next to Eduardo, so I know where it's coming.
No, consider this. There's several countries in Latin America who've really benefited from Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Colombia is one of them, in the sense that the ensuing energy crisis in Europe, as it tried to quickly wean itself off of Russian oil and gas, both drove up the price of oil and enabled Colombia to quintuple its sales of coal to Europe last year versus the year before. So you had a massive amounts of boost in export revenue that came from higher prices and higher volumes of exports. And yet, and a central bank that's not being as hawkish as the Brazilians or Mexicans, but has also lifted interest rates. And yet, the currency is down 20%. Now, why is that? Because the moneyed class in Colombia got their money out, and they got it out quickly. And no moneyed class in Latin America can get its money out of the country as fast as the Colombians are. Why? Because they already moved out in the late 80s, and bought assets, bought property, built businesses abroad, set up accounts. And so they moved very quickly, and billions have left Colombia. And this is why Petro is, pivoting back towards the center. But I think that at the end of the day, I'm concerned about both his radical supporters and how they limit his ability to be more pragmatic policy-wise. I worry about some of the people he got into bed with to finance his campaign. And, the decision, for instance, to stop exploration of gas in Colombian waters, ostensibly for environmental reasons, but what is that going to lead to? The reactivation of a pipeline from Venezuela to pipe in Venezuelan gas. So why would they make that kind of decision? There's a lot of speculation as to who's behind that. I also worry that Petro, who was a terrible mayor of Bogota, he was terrible for several reasons, but mostly because he didn't listen to pragmatic voices, that he insisted on monopolizing decision-making. And I don't know enough about how he governs as a president and whether he listens to advisors, but that worries me. It worries me that often the worst politicians are the smartest ones, and he's a very smart guy. He's very well studied. He understands international economics. He can land in Davos and speak that language to people, but he also believes that his economic policies, for the same reason, are the right ones, and doesn't necessarily listen to those pragmatic voices. So I'm worried about AMLO in the sense that I don't think he has an evil agenda as much as I think that he has a huge ego and a big brain, and he's usually the smartest person in the room, and therefore is not listening enough and taking into account enough pragmatic voices around him, and even what the marketplace is saying and what the money class are saying. Yes, it's good politics to hate the money class as you're campaigning for a presidency, but once you get into power, if you're smart, like Lula was with his first administration, you make peace with those people. Because you can't distribute wealth unless you retain it inside your country. So this is where I think there's fundamental, bad policy and just the wrong personality for that position, unfortunately.
I'll take the last word. 4 years ago, we said, when Duque won the presidency, we said the best advertisement or propaganda for a successful Petro presidency in 4 years hence could very well be the Duque government, which is exactly what happened. It wasn't a foregone conclusion that Petro would rebound from his loss, fairly significant loss the last time he ran. But the perceived in many quarters, including the CEO class, of the incompetence, and to use the words of some, the vanity that there's a whole bunch of adjectives that are used to describe his administration, certainly had a lot to do with this shift. The center or the progressive left, try as they might to capitalize on that and build something other than what people saw as extremes, just could not get their act together for a whole lot of reasons. Not surprisingly, ego being one of the big ones, inconsistencies and the like. Petro won. He won with a bigger percentage than people thought he would vote. He turned out more votes in the areas. When, if you look at his electoral map, the departments he won is the exact same calculation that Santos had won in his second presidential attempt against Zuluaga, and he was also capturing votes in places he had, for example, in Antioquia, which is the conservative bastion as people know, in Colombia. When you talk to CEOs, I just came back from a number of weeks in Colombia, and you ask them what's going on, by and large, and there are differences, but it's as if they're all reading from the same hymnal, because the exact same words they use are desastre total, total disaster. It's okay, well, let's take it issue by issue. How about the issue that on agrarian reform, which everybody knows has to happen? It was one of the top articles in the peace treaty. He's moved forward on that. He's developed an agreement with landowners about buying back land, and the cattle owners in Colombia are about as conservative and as right-wing as one could imagine. He negotiated something that we'll see how that plays out. So you say to your CEOs, as it were, and others, what do you think about that? Oh yeah, no, that was pretty interesting, yeah, okay. What do you think about his program that the entire drug regime has to be completely changed because it's been the war on drugs has been a disaster and it's cost Colombia dearly in millions of lives and money. What do you think about that? Yeah, it really does have to change. I won't say anything publicly, but he's right about that. Okay. How about the peace agreement, or the paz total that he has, which is extremely ambitious, total peace with everybody. How that happens, nobody really knows. But opening up those conversations and putting on one of the negotiating teams, one of the notorious right-wing business people whose wife is one of the I say notorious, well-known right-wing, más uribista que uribista in Congress. What do you think about that move? Well, yeah, that was pretty astute. Yeah, that's pretty interesting. Oh, okay. So how does the balance work? And I think a lot of it came from, and exactly as John sort of talked about it, the lack of clarity on the energy portfolio, and put in a minister. And some of the ministerial appointments were lauded across the board, some not so much. In his group of people, there's not a lot of experience running ministries. And the minister he had doing energy didn't have that experience. Came from public or NGO sector, and was skating across all over the place as to what was going to happen. That's not a good thing when energy is still an important source of income, and at the time you're saying you're trying to find more money to create social programs and do the kinds of things he wants to do. He's sincere about the environmental thing. I mean, there was a comment of so-called, he's absolutely convinced of that, and anybody who listened to his discurso at the GA for the UN and others, he's very, very clear about that, and he's trying to put this all together. That was unfortunate, and so what ended up happening is one of the appointments, which I think many people in this room would consider to be most critical, would be finance minister. He put in a world-respected economist, Ocampo, who he has a political bent, but he's not ideologue by any sense. He's left, progressive left. And so what ended up happening is he's become sort of the super minister, a bit like Ebrard in Mexico. And so when the energy minister says something, then Ocampo says, well, no, I don't think that's happening, that kind of a thing. And so that's created sort of mixed signals, and Petro hasn't helped himself in certain cases by the things he tweets out, as if he's still running a campaign as opposed to running a government. He's falling back into that former role that he had. I think that everybody is saying, let's see what happens in 23. Because let's see how some of these things start to roll out. Let's see if the peace agreement with the ELN gets on track again. Let's see if what happens with agrarian reform. Let's see what there is the tax agreement that was hammered out. It was a lot of back and forth. There was an agreement on raising the minimum wage with Andy, which had been consulted in ways that Andy in the business class never thought they would be consulted. It was a consultative consensus that they arrived at. So I think we'll have to wait and see what rolls out. There's definitely, he definitely has his personal traits, and John talked to, and others as well that are redeeming. So I think the jury's still out. Basically, that's what I think.
And a far better choice than Hernandez would have been.
Yeah,
Let's put it that way.
without saying.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah,
The problem is it wasn't a great choice.
No. Well, that's
Yeah, there-
often the case.
Yeah, and just the final point is anyone who wants to look at those leaders in the center left that were vying to take over, we did 13 episodes with all of the major political leaders in the center and the left. Also on our website, the videos are there. You can see some of them. Some of them have gone into the government, including Alejandro Gaviria, who is now the Minister of Education. He had been the former minister. He had been the former Minister of Health under Santos. He had been the dean or the president of Los Andes University, a well-respected economist. And there are others who have been around in the center. Laura Gil, who's the deputy foreign minister, who's very important and well-respected in the foreign ministry, was also part of the center. Okay, so with that, I want to come to Larry's. Yeah, Luis, but we're really running behind on this. So, but I want to come to the grand finale, which was Larry's question about what does all this mean for Canadian business, or how Canadian business and how Canadian politics or foreign relations, let's say, how should it position itself in Latin America, with Latin America going forward? Who wants to start? John.
So maybe we all make a comment.
Yeah.
We can wrap up.
Yeah.
So I think the main driver of an improvement would be how the government thinks about Latin America and the Americas more generally from a strategic point of view. So the government in Canada, generally speaking, has to be prodded to do things. There's not a lot of proactivity, and I think that's probably a bipartisan comment, to be honest. And we've been around for a long time in this organization, and I think both conservative and liberal governments have been largely more sitting back and watching than really proactive in this way. That is a strategic mistake today. And I think what you've seen in this administration in Ottawa, as it relates to Asia, is that they have begun to think more strategically, put real money behind and real thought behind what is our strategy. And I think that was largely a good thing. Full disclosure, I took part in that committee. And I think we need the same for LATAM, to be honest. I think that there's a lot of pieces. The truth is the pieces of the puzzle in LATAM are far more clear and far more established than they are in Southeast Asia or with Japan or with South Korea. Now we have TPP and all that stuff, but we've had a free trade agreement in North America for a really long time. The first outside North America was Chile, of course, goes way back. And so there's a lot of pieces. We just need to put them on the board. And I think that really goes back to Ottawa. It goes back to the government saying, this is important. And the thing I would share is I think that the strategic urgency, given all the comments we made at the outset of this panel, is high. We need to start thinking strategically as a country, and we got a lot to work with in LATAM. And we have, I think, a good brand, be it in Mexico, be it in Brazil, be it in Colombia, be it certainly in the Andean nations, particularly Chile. It just has to get done. And there's only so much that private sector could do on its own, which we try to do our best, but we need that top-down strategic urgency.
Great. Yeah, John.
I've been fortunate enough to live in 7 countries and 4 continents, and I know as Canadians we complain about our government a lot, but I can tell you that Canada does government pretty well. Not the bluster in Ottawa, but the nuts and bolts of collecting money and giving it out through different programs. And that technical assistance is something that Canada's always done well internationally. I go back to the Toronto Centre as a great example of technical assistance and how we made a material difference in Latin America. And I think if I agree with the geopolitical moment, but really where Canada excels and really what Latin, we've been through amazing political bluster in Latin America the last 2 years, bringing in these disruptive new governments. But what's clear is that they need technical assistance. If they want to change things, it's not just enough to change the law. It's about execution. And Canada's pretty good at execution at the government level. And I would say that if anything, and that doesn't necessarily come from government officials, it will come from a combination of government people, but also consultants who come out of 30 years working in a particular branch of government. And those people and the knowledge they have and the training that they can provide, that's really what I think Canada should focus on, because Latin America doesn't need handouts anymore. Yes, there is Haiti and there are disasters here and there, but what Latin America really needs as a middle-income region is to modernize and strengthen democracy and strengthen institutions, and that requires technical assistance, and that's where I think Canada can really make a difference.
Great, John. Thanks. Solange, do you want to?
Yeah, building on what John said, I think we need to work on strengthening ties between academia in Latin America and Canada, not just business, but yeah, business is very important, and civil society organizations. What I think that Canada can help is to strengthen democracy values in the region, because as I said in my first statement, we are losing that. If we have in Latin America a region without democratic values, the uncertainty on the coming years will be a huge risk. So for Canada, I think the Canadian values, democracy, human rights, are something that we can work with the civil society, the academia, and other organizations beside government-to-government relationship. So, yeah.
Thank you. You don't know this, but we are soon to announce a whole academic advisory board, hopefully with what you said very much at the front of mind. So, good. Eduardo.
I would say believing in the forces of gravity. If a human has a couple more tequilas than is prudent, at some point that person will trip and fall. And I think that principle works in the investment world. There's things which are inevitable. In Mexico right now, the power sector is completely uninvestable. Reality is Mexico's a heavy manufacturing economy, and 55% of the country's power is consumed by manufacturing. The government doesn't have the balance sheet to develop all that power, so eventually it's going to have to cave. That means how that takes form, they can dust off the old pidiregas, a very inefficient but a pragmatic way of financing, which means investors are going to make a lot of money and it's going to be very expensive for the government, but it will eventually fall. And when that falls, everybody is going to scramble in. So I think one of the ways to approach Latin America is to think about those things and say, how do I position? If I'm trying to negotiate the rights for land in a pipeline, I'm trying to negotiate the right for power transmission paths, you don't want to go in when it's super hot and they're going to demand much more ambitious, much more aggressive compensation for it. You have to start going in now when things are cold, because that's the moment to get better prices for things. In that regard, I think Latin America is a place where it's a good idea to think about what topics is gravity going to bring back to normality, and in those be countercyclical.
Thank you. You have the honor of the last word.
I don't know if that's very wise. I'm not Canadian. I know less about Canada than anyone
Yes,
on
but you're
this
from
panel.
London, so you know everything.
So I'll have a slightly different perspective. So some of this stuff might not be feasible at all. But what I can say is that the free trade agenda between Canada and Latin America is incomplete. It takes two to tango, and it might not be on the agenda, but that's sort of an obvious area for development. Another area for development is around industrial policy. So finding out where those synergies lie and working together to sort of promote economic development in areas that are mutually beneficial. Technical assistance is part of that. It's hard for technical assistance to really move the needle, but in key areas, for example, like, so for Canada and Canada's mining sector, we know that in Latin America, there is going to be a lot of shift in environmental policy that could, and in tax and royalty policy that will affect the mining sector. So some sort of, I don't know if this exists, but to some sort of coordination or negotiation or input from Canada of what's going to be happening in that area in particular is particularly important for Canada. Yeah, I guess
That's good.
Yeah,
That's
that'll do.
good. Yeah, pretty good. Like it's 10:12. We said this event goes to 10:15. If there's any very quick, there's anything else I want to say?
No,
Yeah,
I always say this is, we're talking at this level and we brought it down to 15,000 feet. But for anyone who is a strategic investor investing in a mainstream business, all this stuff's important, but at the end of the day, you really have to get local. And there's tons of opportunities in all of these countries. I mean, there's even opportunities in Venezuela today. So, I think that for financial investors, this broad macro view is really material. But I think for more, I don't want to call them real businesses, but strategic investors, the local, there's enormous opportunities and enormous obstacles, and you really have to take a really close look at that.
Okay. Last word to John.
Last word. So first of all, thanks again for joining us here. Thanks to Denton's. Thanks to our supporters whose names are up on the board here. I would say, maybe as a way of summarizing and concluding, that I would say the biggest impediment to your question about Canadian, Latin American interaction is really having the conceptual framework and the imminence of information and insight. And I like to think that the CCA tries to facilitate that process, and our team does an amazing job in that regard. But I do see positive momentum in that regard. So we've been doing this, when did we start? I don't even remember now, 2005, 6? Yeah, so we started in 2006, 7. And, there was a really desultory kind of approach to Latin America. The people who were active didn't know the other people. There was a lot of, I thought, shibboleths about what some of these countries were about. And I've seen a really steady progress in a real awareness and level of insight into the region over the last, call it 16, 17 years. And I think that's what it's about, which is why I think that a combination of these kinds of fora, these kinds of events, this kind of interaction, combined with, as I alluded to earlier, greater level of strategy and understanding that in this geopolitical environment, you have to actually have a strategy. And I would just leave on the point that regional, I think you mentioned this, John, regionalism is back. Now, in many cases, many of the players among the regions haven't got the memo, but regionalism is back. And so kind of the gravity argument applies there too. This has to work because the old hyper-globalized system that we thought was a permanent one, which is actually a blip, a little bit like Athenian democracy, is gone, and it will never come back. Well, I shouldn't say never. It won't come back in my lifetime. So we gotta put this together, and we'll do our best to help that process.
Thank you. There's nothing left for me to say except, first of all, to apologize for those who also wanted information about other countries. We actually were prepared to talk about several other countries, but Chair's discretion, I wanted to go with the flow, that the flow seemed the way we had it. So for those who want to know something about Peru or Argentina or other countries we may not have covered, there are ways of getting questions, to us. You can send them to us, and we'll see if we can get them answered for you. Thank you again for coming. Thank you to our panelists. Again, all our information is at ccacanada.com. We invite you to join with us. We invite you to view what we do. And the final thank you, of course, is to Denton's. This is just a spectacular display of professionalism and savvy at the highest level. And we can bring this to the people watching it and the video precisely because Denton's knows how to do this. So thank you very much, and hope to see you at our future events. Thank you.